Okay, without further ado, it is my pleasure to present to you Dr. Watrous, who is professor of history and also a member of the Holocaust Studies Center Faculty Advisory Committee. As I mentioned to you last week, he has been a good and true friend to us, and he is going to speak on
the master race.
The master race. And so why don't you help me in welcoming Stephen Watrous.
Well, our task today is to investigate how the Nazis, the Germans actually, well before the Nazis, developed an idea, some Germans at least, developed an idea of a master race for themselves, and how under the Third Reich in a short period of 12 years was applied in ways of both promoting a master race and of dealing with perceived enemies, threats to the well-being and the improvement of the master race. When we think of master race, oftentimes we think of things other than Aryan Nazis or superior folk. We think of maybe Wars or Mongols or who knows, maybe in North America you've got some examples that may fill the bill, or the British in India, what have you. Most of these examples, if we wish to entertain them, were ones that happened by conquest one way or another, and by conquest without necessarily a master plan, so to speak, or a master implementation, without the highest knowledge or skills or preconceived idea of exactly how to go about it. And this is in contrast to the Nazi application of master race, which was seemingly well planned, or at least well thought through in the mind of Adolf Hitler and some of his followers that were already deeply entrenched as anti-Semites and anybody that was perceived as impeding the better being of Germans. Let's take a look at a few definitions of what the master race consisted of. Generally speaking, the term that's used almost synonymously with master race is the term Aryan, at least the Nazi use of the term Aryan. And some of you may consider this term widely applicable to anyone who speaks, or especially in the European and the Eurasian continents, speaks an Indo-European language. This broadly conceived term Aryan, which emerges in the scientific literature of the early 19th century, about 200 years ago, would apply to anyone who spoke a language from Irish to Iranian. And I use these examples specifically because they both have within the root of the word Aryan this term that meant one who was an aristocrat. In fact, the very word aristocrat relates to the term Aryan, as does Ireland and Iran. The Greek god of war, Ares, also fits into this. So there's a broad scientific base for this term Aryan, but the Nazis tended to apply it more specifically to North Europeans, Germans, English, Dutch, Anglo-Saxon, if you will, Scandinavian. They may have the proper behavior, the proper language, or not, proper culture, proper physical appearance, proper ideology or worldview to qualify as Aryan, and Hitler definitely kept this open. He could include blonde Poles as Aryans, despite their language or even their culture, if it looked as though they fit down the line. So we've got a rather elastic use of Aryan by the Nazis, and inclusion, so to speak, into the master. In 1943, the commissioner for the Ukraine, Erich Koch, declared when he got to the Ukraine, quote, "We are a master race. And we must remember that the lowliest German laborer is racially and biologically 1,000 times more valuable than the native population here in the Ukraine, Slavic Ukrainians." So here we've got some incredibly exalted idea of just how much better quantitatively the master race is than Ukrainians, who are also Indo-European speaking peoples. On a visit to the East during the war, Heinrich Himmler commented upon what he saw there in the former USSR. This Mongol race of Slavs, you can see how elastic that is. The Mongols are quite different from the Slavs, as any Russian would tell you, but for Himmler they're all one. They're built upon a subhuman race that's been invigorated by a few drops of our blood. Well, this quote actually says quite a bit. It shows you just how sloppy Himmler was in terms of differentiating of one people from another, but also it very nicely, so to speak, shows us this idea of blood, or if you will, the Nazis didn't use this term, but of kind of gene pools, that a few drops of German blood would do an enormous amount to improve or invigorate some of these subhuman races of just one. And this, I think, is important too, because we have to keep in mind that whether it was Jews or Slavs, they could be regarded as subhuman. And even this, for Jews, was a step higher than being demonized as a kind of demon race, or in some cases even an anti-race that had lost all of its true racial characteristics, of at least cultural characteristics. Well, going on, we want master race was to predominate not only in Germany but across the continent, and in this respect it does resemble more a Mongol conquest or a conquistador conquest of half a continent or more. But that's about where the resemblance stops, as we'll see. After the Nazi defeat in 1945, the Nuremberg war crimes trials were held, and so, as we mentioned last time, outside influences played a role in developing race consciousness as well. Well, needless to say, those that failed to qualify as members of the master race were those that had a number of different characteristics, and it wasn't just a matter of Aryan blood or Aryan background. This was attitudes. In other words, Nazi-style attitudes. They couldn't be liberal, communist, socialist, whatever else, ideologically or for that matter religiously. They couldn't be capitalistically inclined either, and they had to participate actively. And those who didn't do Heil Hitler quite as enthusiastically as others could be regarded as suspect and subject to kind of non in the master race. So we've got basically criteria that are applied loosely, needless to say, to who the master race enveloped in its community. The vision of a national community, a community of the German folk, was important here, the so-called Volksgemeinschaft. This was the national community that was very loosely move on, is a model that at least some Germans saw for themselves in terms of the structure of the master race. And this was one of the educators in the Third Reich who made a comparison. Athens, the rest must obey and work. In this way alone we can attain that peak performance. We must state. Germany, as we saw briefly in the film before, had its, how shall we say, had its conquering heroes, the Teutonic Knights and so forth. But even here, these were not representative of a single united national monarchy or nation state, if you will. In Germany was divided into a number of small principalities. Well, some small, some large. But the fact is that what Germany did have as a claim to fame was a title of the Holy Roman Empire, sometimes called the Holy Roman Empire. And in the 1600s, Germany suffered through a devastating 30 years war between the Protestant and Catholic forces of Europe and of Germany as well that aggravated Germany's humiliation and accentuated Germany's division for several hundred years more. So Germany had this problem, especially in retrospect. It wasn't seen as a problem so much at the time, but when Napoleon came and just ran roughshod over Germany after the French Revolution, a lot of Germans began to wake up. They had expected great things from the French Revolution, some Germans did, and here was Napoleon busting up the old Holy Roman Empire and reorganizing the states of Germany to suit his own purposes. And for some Germans this was okay. They were getting rid of some of their old rulers and engaging in social political reforms, but for others it was humiliating, and they were committed to the idea of driving out Napoleon state, a united state. And it was at this point in time that we begin to have the first of these so-called folkish ideas of a great and glorious future lying ahead for Germany that would be unique in Europe. It wouldn't be like what the French or even the British had. It would be something specially German, but as to what it would be like, it was too difficult to tell. In fact, there was already in the early 1800s, this is a century before World War I now, but as to exactly what it would be was not determined too much. It was still too early. Germany was still divided and so forth. So this is in some ways the environment that emerges in the 19th century when some German thinkers, certainly not all, because we have liberals and later on we have socialist thinkers and we've got just regular nationalist thinkers that want to unify Germany and stop with that. We also have these so-called folkish thinkers, anti-materialistic, anti-industrial in many ways, looking for a special German way that isn't based on technology and industry, but a kind of special connection to the soil, to the German land, one way or another. But there's also this vision of the Germans having to, how should we say, having alien populations oppressing them one way or another, getting in the way of their national destiny. This might be when Darwinism became popular. In fact, we can even see this idea of German national destiny above everything else, even at the time of Napoleon. Any kind of might will make right as long as it leads to a German nation state. This is in the Johann Fichte, our first name here on the contributors to the master race idea. Any kind of cunning or deceit was important for the cause of unifying the Germans in a nation. That I think is important as we move along in the 19th century is this idea of perfectibility. Whether it's the perfectibility of the human condition altogether, which was a Enlightenment idea, the perfectibility of mankind as it was expressed during the French Revolution, or just the perfectibility of the nation, or the perfectibility of the race. At any rate, this vision of we can move toward a better world, one that suits our purposes much better than we had before. It's built in with this idea of progress. Certainly, Hitler believed in a vision of progress for his chosen people, so to speak. So I think this whole idea of we can improve the human condition, utopian as it may be, but buoyed along by technology and contributed to what Nazism would become later on. And we ought to do it fast. We're not just going to sit around and let things happen slowly. We'll talk about the urgency factor later on. Certainly Christianity as another Western value at this time was a part of the seedbed of folkish Semitism, whether it's theological, biblical, economic, or later on racial. All of this owes something to the long tenure of Christianity in Central Europe and elsewhere, for that matter. The idea of nationalism, obviously very important in the 19th century, as people could see from what a nation united could do, such as France. Orient showed the powers of a united nation that seemed to have its act in gear, and what one leader could do. And even though we don't see we don't see too many new nation states emerge in Europe in the 19th century, the unification of Germany was one of these in 1871, along with the unification of Italy and a few other Balkan states and so forth. But the unification of Germany in some ways was anticlimactic for some of these romantic folkers. Here we have a couple of wars, we have a unified Germany, but it doesn't have a special mystery to it. It doesn't seem to have a special dynamic. It's ridden with bureaucrats, the old monarchy and so forth, the Hohenzollern Prussian monarchy. It seems to be too Philistine in its character and so forth. So the vision that Germans ought to be something more. There needs to be something more to their nation. And along with this went the idea that the unification of Germany wasn't a complete unification because it impacted Christianity one way or another. We have someone like Nietzsche who talks about a new kind of spiritual type who would rise above the mundane, the Philistine, the average individual, not necessarily just German, of course, but some kind of a Superman or Übermensch that would be a dominant type and of somewhere in the future. And this idea was eagerly approved by Nazis later on, and especially through Nietzsche's sister, who greeted the Nazis. And in this sense, someone like Nietzsche was seen as a kind of prophetic voice that looked forward to a master race type of individual that was both spiritually and physically superior. Others talked about the hardy Saxon peasant that lived close to the soil, wasn't any kind of a superman, was important. This idea becomes more attractive, more seemingly more realizable during World War I, when Germany was fighting for greater influence in the east of Europe, and in fact her armies moved into areas as far east as the Ukraine and Western Russia. So the vision of German armies actually having been there, even though they retreated, gave Germans a kind of taste of implementation of this vision. Well, let's take a brief look through our relevant terms and concepts. Basically, many of these were already developed before World War I. And as one commentator points out, Hitler and Nazi 18. So this was one of the problems that we're all aware of, that Germany lost a war that Germans did not expect to lose, and certainly not expect to lose so enormously, with the onerous peace treaty that emerged, the Versailles Treaty. As most of you know by now, terms were imposed on Germany that must have been the work of concessionaries, people that gave in to the Allies or to Denmark. So these were very important injuries, so to speak, to many Germans that obviously caused an even greater humiliation than Germany had suffered earlier on in her history, in the days before Germany was a United Nations state. And so this vision of somehow Germany having to emerge from the ashes was... World War I sparked huge ambitions for the reconstruction of a new world order. And in this sense, I think we can put three major figures at this time in the same bed together, so to speak, the bed of reshaping, restructuring the world one way or another, two of whom were in power in 1918, and Hitler would be in power 15 years later as the third of these individuals. And the first two are Lenin, and certainly Wilson's big vision of restructuring the world was to make the world safe for democracy. This was his rationale for dragging the United States into the war in the first place. And of course, it was important in his attempt to negotiate the peace treaties so that democracy could be safer, and especially safe in Germany, so that regardless of some of the stipulations and conditions of the Versailles Treaty, Germany, others were happy, of course, to see this in the center and to some degree on the left. What results from this very egalitarian multi-party democracy was a kind of gridlock in many ways because of the representation of the many different kinds of parties from right to left, including center, and a shifting of alliances and so forth, so that the idea of democracy definitely had its discontents. It did get some things done, but it wasn't which Hitler could blame for the Versailles Treaty in the first place. Not just the Allies, but Jewish financial and other interests behind this effort to keep Germany down at the end of the war. So, in this sense, Wilson had an important idea for a new world order, and Lenin had one too. Lenin's vision, of course, was very different from Wilson's, but from Hitler's point of view, you might say Christianity. Marxism was a Jewish idea with a chosen people. And for Lenin, of course, the vision was we need to restructure the world, to get rid of exploiting classes, especially the capitalist classes out there. And so Lenin established a communist international, and you might say that the fear of communism was all important for many of the establishment have types, whether they're Germany, Western Europe, United States, and so forth, and to some degree, some of the nationalistic successes that Hitler and others of the radical right enjoyed in their effort to do away with Jewish Bolshevism, if you will. But the point is that we've got these grand expectations of the restructuring of the world, whether it comes from Lenin or Wilson, or of course Adolf Hitler, who's already dealing with his own vision of restructuring the world as well. Let's take a brief look at Hitler in the early 1920s. A German journalist in 1922, even before Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, asked Hitler, according to Joseph Hell, whole public gathering, once I really am in power, my first and foremost task will be the annihilation of the Jews. As soon as I have the power to do so, I will have gallows built in rows at the Marienplatz, the main square, in Munich, for example, as many gallows as traffic allows. Then the Jews will be hanged indiscriminately, and they will remain hanging until they stink. They will hang there as long as the principles of hygiene permit. As soon as they've been he wanted ultimately, as we know, to rid all of Europe of Jewry, or racial Jews, if you will. So that's at least some idea of where Hitler stood back in 1922 before he wrote Mein Kampf. Let's take a few. Blood alone resides the strength as well as the weakness of man. As long as, well, let's go on. He compares racial types and people state of their blood. And the change in their intellectual and creative force is the only effect of the change in their racial foundations. So in effect, they get weaker. I'm not here to dispute Hitler. We'll leave other people in the lecture series to take care of that issue. I'm just trying to get his viewpoint across as translated in Mein Kampf. Any crossing of two beings not at exactly the same That means mixing, reproducing, okay, of two human beings not exactly at the same level produces a meat. History shows with terrifying clarity that in every mingling of Aryan blood with that of lower peoples, the result will be the end of the cultured people. Now here's an example that may strike you as close to home. North America, whose population consists in by far the largest part of Germanic elements, who mixed but little with the lowered colored peoples, shows a different humor from Central and South America, where the predominantly Latin immigrants often mixed with the Aborigines on a large scale. The Germanic inhabitant of the American continent who has remained racially pure and unmixed, rose to be master of the continent. He will remain master as long as he does not fall a victim to defilement of the blood. Maybe I'm going on too much with this, beating the point home, not intending to try to approximate can-do pure German blood back in the Middle Ages before there was mixing. Without the clearest knowledge of the racial problem, and hence of the Jewish problem, there will never be a resurrection of the German nation. The racial question gives us the key not only to world history, but to all human culture. So this vision of a resurrected Germany that certainly was not the Weimar Republic, Wilson style, in the 1920s, could not be resolved or attained until somehow knowledge of the racial problem, but the settlement, the solution, if you will, of the Jewish problem. I've got more to read. Do you really want it? Well, some of this, you don't want it, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you may have heard it, you may not, but even if you've heard it, it bears hearing again. Here Hitler shows his respect, his grudging respect for the Jew. The mightiest counterpart to the Aryan is represented by the Jew. Why? Well, we'll find out. Hopefully it's here, and I won't have to paraphrase. In hardly any people of the world is the instinct of self-preservation developed more strongly than in the so-called chosen people. The Jewish people, despite all apparent intellectual qualities, however, is without any true culture, without any culture of its own, because it's assimilables. We'll use it just as our example here. No, the Jew possesses no culture-creating force of any sort. In other words, it's survived longest because of its history, its tradition, its religion, its culture. These are my words, by the way, not Hitler's. And yet it has no culture because, especially in Germany, it has assimilated itself. The Jews have assimilated themselves. Let's personify them, please. In fact, in contrast to parts of Eastern Europe where their culture has visibly remained in modern Germany. But along with this, the Jews never possessed a state of their own with any definite territorial limit. And Hitler very definitely holds this against European Jews. One reason why they've assimilated. They have had no territorial state. What's wrong with them? Well, they're parasitic. The Jew is and remains the typical parasite, a sponger who, like a noxious bacillus, keeps spreading as soon as a favorite Jew contaminates art, literature, the theater, and makes a mockery of healing, overthrows all concepts of beauty and sublimity, of the noble and of the good, and instead drags men down into the sphere of his own base nature. Well, that's Hitler speaking. Remember our SS man last time? I don't have the notes right. Oh, I do, but I'm not going to try to find them, thank you. The man who married the special, eugenically appropriate lady that you saw the picture of, he talked about how I would agree, but they excel in literature, the arts, in business, and so forth. He didn't say it all gnashing his teeth, but this was at least his point of view, and in this sense he didn't look at the contamination of it, but he saw the Jews as, you might say, superior in many ways to Germans in these things. So here, even with an SS man compared to Hitler, we get some different views about Jewish relationship to the arts in the sense. Themselves, obviously, on the streets, in the public, the German public after the war, war wounded, and so forth. And there was, you might say, this kind of Darwinistic idea of the vitality of the nation was on the minds of a number of Germans, and not just of Adolf Hitler. And these weren't all just proto-Nazis necessarily either. They were concerned about how can we improve the health of the nation. As I had on your handout last week, the supreme law, and how do we go about trying to improve this. And so this idea, the eugenic vision of selective breeding, was tossed around in the 1920s one way or another. How to boost the birth rate among the Germans. This, of course, would not become a reality until the Third Reich. And interestingly, during the Depression, it was only in Hitler's Germany that, in Europe, that the birth rate did in contrast to other countries. But the idea also of sterilization, especially of those that had hereditarily transmittable ailments, incurable diseases, and so forth, and how we had to make sure that if we're going to have a Germany that can recover from the war, from the reparations, from the humility, so forth, they will have a strong people once again. So, in some ways, World War I tended to accentuate this issue of how can we reestablish the health of the nation. And this obviously meant eliminating dregs, quote unquote, among the population, those that couldn't carry their own one way or another. It didn't mean necessarily extermination at this point, but what do we do with such people that are a drag on society, that are not leistungsfähig, so to speak, that can't shoulder their own and are just a parasite or a sponger, so to speak. And of course, Jews oftentimes seen as a part of this, whether or not they'd suffered in the war or not. So some kind of transformation of the body politic was discussed at this time. Sterilization was another idea that was, in fact, during the Depression, the quest for voluntarily sterilization if you had a hereditary disease. Not that they had a lot of takers on this. Vasectomy was seen as the major implementation of any kind of sterilization back then. But at any rate, compulsory sterilization would be the Third Reich answer to the low turnout of those that voluntarily submitted to sterilization. In 1933, a sterilization law was in fact passed very early in the first year of the Third Reich. Compulsory sterilization for those with hereditary illnesses. Well, what kind of illnesses were considered as sterilized against chorea? Schizophrenia. Remember the lady that had her mother put to death later on? This is about in the late 30s, I believe. And she's still obviously deeply affected by this, by her mother's schizophrenia. Chronic alcoholism, manic depressive illness. Maybe it was manic depressive for the mother. Many diseases that were questionably hereditary fell under the rubric of voluntarily sterilized. In the 11 years or so in which the law was applied, there were over 300,000 that were legally sterilized, and over 100 deaths that followed the operation of these 320,000 sterilized Germans, most of whom could be classified as part of the Aryan population, but a threat to its future health. In this respect, we might say that Nazis were 1,000 years rather than just the next generation. But on the other hand, they weren't going to wait 1,000 years. They wanted to get moving fast, in a way just as Lenin or Stalin, more the contemporary of Hitler, wanted to move fast against the internal enemies threatening to pull down the grand social experiment and get them right away. Okay, you have on the back of national and had their rights stripped, their civil rights stripped from them. As we saw last week, the Jewish population of Germany, roughly 500,000 at this time, was forced to have its own schools, its own clubs, a kind of social apartheid. Here we can see Hitler moving slowly obviously he didn't want to make his vision of extermination known not only to who weren't ready for this kind of news, but he did not want to get foreign opinion and foreign boycotts or foreign punitive reactions to affect the German economy, which he was trying to reinvigorate at this time. If there were foreign demonstrations against some of Hitler's policies, he just kind of shrugged them off as foreign Jews in New York or London or wherever that were protesting, that were leading the protests. Quote, foreign Jews and their puppets, Roosevelt or you name it, could do to, how should we say, restrict German economic development one way or another. And generally speaking, Hitler's timing was pretty good, pretty keen in this respect. Let's just comment that Hitler wanted to try the simplest solutions first, such as emigration. You've got underneath a temporary solution. And we can certainly see this when the Wehrmacht, the military forces, are moving all over Europe, and Jews are rounded up systematically, bureaucratically. Not a single one of them, well, with very few exceptions, supposed to be on the lam or to stay loose. We had to make sure that Jewish blood was exterminated so it wouldn't dilute the higher qualities of citizenship law. Part of the Nuremberg laws, which stripped non-Aryans of civil rights and citizenship. In fact, here interestingly, we've got German Jews that were willing to think that, well, this is about as far as Adolf Hitler can go. His master race vision will not go any farther than that, and we'll just live a segregated apartheid type of life as non-citizens, hopefully protected by the state. The very extent of Hitler's genocidal traits, and very few had any conception of what was around the corner. This was totally unprecedented in any civilization, let alone Western civilization, which was capable of doing this kind of thing, as we all will see as World War II comes around. Well, so far we haven't talked too much about improving the master race, other than making life miserable for the aliens and those of bad blood. In fact, the Berlin Olympics are a good case in point of on German Jews, going on good behavior, a certain kind of lull in the attacks, in the Aryanization of Jewish businesses and appropriation of their wealth to help out the German economy or the Nazi state. The Berlin Olympics, of course, didn't turn out exactly the way that Hitler wanted them to, but basically we've got foreigners with Jewish representatives and non-Aryan representatives that come to the Jews of Germany, took a few extra breaths thinking that this was about all that could possibly happen. 1938, we see the stepping up of the struggle against gypsies and the annexation of Austria in March of that year, and by November, the night of broken glass, or crystal, if you will, where we've got a wholesale bashing of Jews, wrecking of shops, arresting of Jews, an atmosphere of fear and intimidation, which was really the first major assault in Jews out of Germany, and not exactly trying to find places to relocate them outside of Germany, but basically the internal war was on, and by 1939 we see the last chance for German Jews to emigrate, and the beginning of what Hitler and Himmler called the Great Racial War, World War II, as a war to exterminate all the Jews under cover of a slightly more conventional war against Jewish Bolshevik-inspired egalitarian system, and for that matter also to conquer the fertile lands of the East, the Ukraine, of Poland and so forth, that would allow for the aristocratic master race to settle and dominate, with the servile races, subhuman races, depending upon the vocabulary of the moment, to work as the 90% that we saw reflected in that Greek idea, so to speak, of ancient Greece now becoming the slave and servile laborers doing unskilled work for the most part, and to apply technology, the latest in technology, in dominating these people, whether it's transportation or mining or industrial, you name it. So the war provides a number of purposes for Hitler, and before we get into the war, we need to take a look at what was going on to embrace. And this means not just the arranged marriages, so to speak, or the questionnaire marriages that we caught a glimpse of last time, but also to educate the elite of the elite. We find that with the maintenance of the SS into the Third Reich period, we've got Hitler's already chosen bodyguard, if you will, writ large, as a special elite type race. And the vision that there would be selective educational systems that would break away, if you will, from the new universal education system, excluding Jews and gypsies and so forth, that Hitler implemented in the first years of the Reich. There were established over time, you might say, 2 schools for young boys, master race type boys, the Adolf Hitler Schulen, that included boys from 12 to 18, and then there were the so-called NAPOLAs, the National Political Educational Institutes, and both of these trained elite boys for jobs in the SS, or as officers in the military, or as administrators of the greater Reich, or to prepare them for the upcoming war. This went on since the mid-1930s. But it also was to try to train the young of the master race in terms of character traits, character building. The NAPOLAs were directed by SS personnel, and they wanted to develop courage, dedication, simplicity, physical abilities, from riding horses to flying in gliders, driving cars and motorcycles, whatever it might be, to get them to become the dominant ruling elite of a new Europe. So they were kind of military training schools in many ways. And in the Adolf Hitler schools, we have more of an ideological cast. Here we've got boys that were trained that had political training. They were trained in racial biology, folklore, the customs of foreign countries, administrative preparation. There was to be report cards. You were to be evaluated by instinct. Your instructor's instinct would determine what kind of promotion you got or what kind of assessment you got on your paper or your performance, whatever it might be. You had to prove your leadership. There were special admission ceremonies. Guess what day of the year you were allowed into an Adolf Hitler school? Hitler's what? His birthday, right. Need I ask what the day is after Columbine? Mountains of Berg's project. He was Hitler's racial advisor. You saw him speaking last week, but he was unidentified. And here at the National Socialist University, they were supposed to deal with confiscated works, banned publications, and so forth, because they were going to undertake research on Jews, their history, their past, their culture, and so forth. Not just physical research, but cultural research, or whatever was there. The first one opened in 1941, but it kind of bogged down. So you can see there was a national. Also have this interesting question of Nazi religion that the elite were to be attracted to. Let's put it this way: the Nazis and Hitler did not have a specific organizational vision of this when Hitler came to power in 1933. It was important to Hitler, as it was to some of the folk 19th century, to de-Judaize Christianity, to get the Jewish elements out of Christianity. This movement, so to speak, called itself the German Christians. and they were looking for a kind of Germanic reformation of Christianity in the spirit of, well, at least in the 20s and 30s, of the spirit of National Socialism. They sought to abolish the Old Testament and to purge the New Testament of the Rabbi Paul, and to create a heroic Christ figure as the basis for an appropriate Christianity. Needless to say, whatever Christ figure this would be, it would have to be at least blue-eyed and possibly blonde. This was important because Nazis saw Jesus the Galilean as separate from your mainline Jew. The Galileans supposedly were some kind of Indo-European pocket that had made their way into Palestine, Israel, whatever you want to call it, back then. And somehow, because of Jesus' behavior, he had to have had master race or Aryan characteristics, all right? But all Oriental distortion had to be purged from Christianity. Well, the German Christians broke down into a number of factions here and there, and they squabbled among themselves, and Hitler decided he really didn't want to deal with Christianity in any form itself. The Nazis dropped their original plan for a German Christian. There came to be two options, so to speak, and this didn't go very far, but one was the idolization of Hitler as the personification of providence, God, if you will, with all of its proper pageantry, songs, theatrics, uniforms, ceremonies, and so forth. So this, in some ways, we have this basically a Hitler cult that was already there in place, but supposedly would take the place of more traditional religion. And then we've got the God that Professor Steiner mentioned in our discussion last week, which Alfred Rosenberg was involved in. The God belief was drawn from some of the folkish thinkers, Lagarde especially, of the 19th century, and it was racist in its essence. It kind of concocted in an early Germanic vision of what nature and nature's God was all about. But the National Socialist Party was not out to Gleichschalt, to synchronize with the Hitler cult altogether, and not even a God belief, nature-based religion. Well, so much for the education of the master race elites. The future emerges. In fact, the future is very urgent. We've got to get on with this process of cleansing Europe of blood poisoners, especially Jews. And so this obviously, Germanic Aryans, honorable Aryans, Slavs especially those that were anti-Semitic, were courted and favorably responded on their part to serving the master race out there in the field. So we've got all kinds of opportunities for Slavs and Hungarians and whoever the Ostfolk, the people of the East, might be, to cooperate in this respect. And we see evidences of this in the media ever so often. Some Ukrainian or East European were not deaths. And as we can see, the duration of the front in the East allowed for 24 million Soviet citizens to die, among them a number of Jews, almost 6 million Poles to die, lots of Jews in that respect, over 4 million Germans to die, 6 million Jews of various nationalities, or various nation states, if you will, 30 million refugees in this, if you will, of the master race ideal in terms of trying to put it to work. We saw last week the activities of the Einsatz group and the special units out there on the sand dunes of Latvia, shooting Poles that are, mainly Jews brought from various parts of Eastern Europe. And that was just the prelude to finding a far more efficient way to doing away with the enemies. Chambers really didn't know that much until the last hour or two of what their fate was going to be, as another, you might say, plum in Hitler's cap in terms of pulling off such an enormously unbelievable phenomenon of being able to carry out the Holocaust as effectively as he did. This Holocaust is a Holocaust without precedent, before and since. You have never seen a continent-wide Holocaust, a genocide like this one, with one under cover of war, a world war at that, one with all of the systematization, the huge number of forces used to pull it off, with the documentation in this genocide, with the bureaucracy cooperating to the degree that it did, and almost wiping out Europe's entire Jewish population. Actually, I was looking for questions. I hope there's some questions out there, or comments. Please.
I wanted to know about the Olympics that took place in Berlin. Countries knew that Germany was beginning to practice like Kristallnacht and the extermination and
Probably wasn't, to use a Nazi phrase, was considerable by this time. But by letting up on it and making sure that the homeless and panhandlers and whatever else, Moscow was a little bit like this. Dissidents had already been rounded up. They were safely in the camps or whatever. Were out of the way so that Berlin could appear as a clean city, clean area city. This was as much as Hitler could want, other than making sure that Jesse Owens or somebody would do as well as he could do in the Olympics. And of course, that kind of thing was slacking the film.
Was 2 years older than me. In the early 40s, we remember that there were certain people that were walking around the neighborhood that one day showed up with scars of paper from their lapels. And then she noticed after a while that they disappeared. And she didn't have any specific information about that, but at that age, about 6, 7 years old, she noticed this, and she intuitively know that it wasn't okay to ask mommy.
And generally speaking, one of the other women's organizations, kind of Nazi para-party organizations, so there were positions that women could rise in, but they had to have the proper Nazi stamp of approval. But the kind of old liberal democracy institutions that women had important roles in, they were no longer wanted there. They were excluded to the liberal democracy.
Yeah, I wanted to add that they also cut down the upper education for women. That it was
A required green Susan. She pointed out the stories of people who ran into trouble with the civil authorities because they weren't at that time pro-Hitler. They go to the offices and they wouldn't give the salute whenever they had to do some sort of municipal requirements and everything, and they got in trouble. People would come by later and tell them, you're breaking this law, or you're not one of the team players, you're going to lose your job, and this sort of thing.
German society. And on the other hand, we have a leader, Hitler, a would-be leader, that stresses the intent of what he wants to do with these ideas and taking them to an extreme that many of these folkish thinkers and these folkish ideas were just kind of contemplating one way or another. I mean, there's this milieu, this environment there where an intentionalist like Hitler could build. Many of the folkish thinkers that you might say provide part of this functional base, this understructure that could be drawn upon, did not dare go any farther than just suggest some of these ideas. In fact, some of them disavowed many of the ideas that they brought out. So, but to bring this into the 20th century, we've got basically the controversy between to what degree were the German people to follow along Hitler, and that were they already anti-Semitic enough that they really wanted to see the elimination of Jews. This would be more the functionalist idea, and the intentionalist one that Hitler knew from the very beginning that there was a straight line that he wanted to implement, and Hitler just wasn't fumbling around. Well, I've gotten this far, now I can proceed to whatever it lies next, and then pretty soon he realized he can go all the way. He wanted to go. This is the intentionalist point of view back in the 20s when he wanted to hang all the Jews in Munich from the gallows in the streets.
I think the question is, would the Holocaust be possible without Hitler? And I think the answer to that is clear cut.
But there are other people who ask whether the Holocaust would have been possible without the war as well.
Well, but I mean, without Hitler to begin with. and without the war certainly also, but I think, you know what,
Well, you get back to the question of the great person, or the ungreat person in history. To what degree do great individuals find an opening and have a context there that they can drag along with them willingly, the ordinary German, and have such results?
Perhaps you can ask Professor Watrous the question after. We're running quite late today, and students still need to sign up. Thanks very much for
Ahem.